Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures.
So let's talk about the anxiety disorders. Anxiety is not always used in our everyday language in the same way psychologists define it. Anxiety is what we call a future-oriented mood state. You can't be anxious about the past. You can't be anxious about the present. Anxiety is always about something bad could happen. It's always a future-oriented based emotion. And while you're worrying about the future, your amygdala hears, there might be a tiger around the corner, there might be a tiger around the corner, there might be a tiger around the corner. There isn't one, but there might be. So we should kind of get a little bit prepped. And so the hypothalamus partially activates the sympathetic nervous system. It's just, there's not a tiger yet, but just in case there was. So there's a set of physical symptoms you have when you're anxious. These are similar to what we experience when we're in the resistance phase of the general adaptation syndrome. Fear is what you feel in the moment. We call it a present-oriented mood state. There is a tiger in this room right now. Be afraid. And if you are experiencing an immediate danger, then you're going to have that alarm phase of the general adaptation syndrome activated, the fight or flight response. And so you're going to get a full activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And in really extreme cases, this is fear so extreme, you have what's called a panic attack. And Chance is actually going to teach us about what a panic attack is a little bit later. Okay? And both of these are negative moods. Nobody's like, yay, I'm afraid or I'm anxious. Like, you feel bad when you're feeling this. Now, what about the past? What we find is the past, if you're worried about things that have already happened, that tends to be associated more with depression. And we call that rumination. Oh, I shoulda, woulda, coulda. Oh, if only I had. And it tends to be less associated with the anxiety-based disorders that we're going to be talking about. Make sense? Now, here's the thing you need to know about emotions and moods. They're not in and of themselves good or bad. They actually serve a role in our lives. So a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of worry that something bad could happen spurs you to act to prevent it. I could fail the test. What could you do to prevent failing the test? Please, somebody know. Okay, study, right? So part of why you do well in school is you have a little anxiety, right? That anxiety sometimes is what you need to finish studying, right? If you thought, I passed, no problem, you probably wouldn't study. The difficulty with anxiety is too much overwhelms you and it cripples you. The advantage of anxiety is it helps you prepare, but if you're too anxious, then you're frozen and you can't prepare. And then you start avoiding risks. And that means avoiding life. Fear is also good. If there was a tiger in the room with us right now, fear is going to trigger that fight or flight response, and that's going to give us our best possible chance of living. Too much fear is going to cause excessive avoidance of things where there could be something scary, and escape if we encounter these fear-inducing stimuli. And panic, which is that extreme version of fear, where you have this extreme response without real danger, can be crippling. So too much of either one of these is bad. And so what happens when you have too much of a good thing? You get an anxiety-related disorder. We've all felt anxious, maybe a lot in the last 6 months. We've all felt fear. They're common emotions. So what distinguishes sort of normal fear and anxiety from a disorder is going to be that significant distress and impairment in functioning, right? Having some trouble sleeping 1 or 2 nights, that's relatively common. It's normal. It's going to be that sustained period significantly interfering with my functioning because I haven't slept well in months. That's where the disorder's going to come in. So the DSM-5 used to put every disorder that had fear or anxiety as a component all in the same chapter. They have since divvied them out. So we're going to focus today on the disorders that have, or I can't see my chat here in case somebody says something. We're going to focus on the disorders today that have excessive anxiety or fear. We'll do the trauma and stressor related and the obsessive compulsive related later. Part of why they're separated out is because we now know that they have unique etiologies, unique symptomatology, and unique treatments. So what works for panic disorder doesn't work for OCD. And so they're different things. And so remember the DSM-5 tried to group the types of disorders in a way that was more meaningful. Before we get into the specific disorders, I want to talk about kind of what we know about the anxiety disorders and what they share. Like every disorder we've talked about in this class, there is not a single cause. It is a complex interaction between multiple factors. In the case of anxiety, we call it triple vulnerability model. There's 3 things that sort of converge here. You have a degree of generalized biological vulnerability. There's not a gene for panic disorder, but you have a genetic profile that makes you more vulnerable to anxiety or fear reactions. That is coupled with a psychological vulnerability, usually based on your past experiences, your learning history, what you've been exposed to, how you've lived your life. And so you have people that are walking around right now with some biological vulnerability and some psychological vulnerability, and they can walk through their whole lives and never get an anxiety disorder. But if they encounter a specific psychological vulnerability, that could set it off. You put another person that doesn't have those vulnerabilities in the same specific psychosocial stressor, and they weather it just fine. They don't develop the disorder. And so it's almost like you're born with an Achilles heel, and then somebody hits it with an arrow. So what are those biological things? Well, it's not a single gene. It is multiple genes that interact. What we do know is anxiety-related disorders run in families. Not that my mom has panic disorder, so I'm going to have panic disorder. It may be My mom has panic disorder and I have generalized anxiety disorder. Or I have a phobia and my kid has, a different anxiety disorder. So there's like that generalized genetic vulnerability. Genes related to CRF, which is one of the components of that generalized adaptation syndrome, corticotropin releasing factor, is what eventually triggers the adrenaline gland to release things like cortisol. So genes that are impacting that seem to be playing a role. We also see that there is commonly some inherited or family trait, we're not exactly sure if it's genetic or learned, negative affect. People that are kind of gloomy gusses, see the storm cloud, not the silver lining. If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. People that are kind of prickly, irritable, and also highly driven people. So some parts of that are inherited, and so we see that we see these trends in families, and so there's an interaction there. When we look in the brain, there's a couple of different neurotransmitters that we look at. We see that 3 are lower. There are lowered levels of GABA. GABA is the slow things down neurotransmitter. Chill out, man. So it makes sense that that would be low. Also, norepinephrine and serotonin tend to be low. Obviously, we've talked about how the fight or flight response gets kind of activated at differing levels, depending on if it's anxiety or fear. So the limbic system, which the amygdala is kind of the heart of, and the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, may have some kind of dysfunction in how that fight or flight response is turned on and turned off. So this is just a reminder of the very busy slide that we went over way at the beginning of the semester, which is what happens when you encounter a perceived threat. The amygdala tells the hypothalamus, tiger. The hypothalamus triggers 2 separate pathways. One is activation via the sympathetic nervous system. So hardwire neuron to neuron communication to the adrenal gland to pump out epinephrine or adrenaline, depending on what you want to call it. The other one, the hypothalamus secretes that corticotropin releasing factor. The pituitary, which sits right there beside it, gets that. That triggers it to release a hormone that eventually tells the adrenal gland to secrete those cortisol hormones. So if we're having trouble related to being over anxious or over fearful, it would make sense that something's going wrong in that system. They're going to come through this. But what are those psychological vulnerabilities? What are the psychosocial contributions? Well, we know that people who have early childhood experiences in which they have uncontrollability and unpredictability. Kids like predictability. They don't have a lot of control. So having predictability, reliable, responsive caregivers, routines help us feel safe and secure. So in early childhood, if you have chaos, then you're not going to feel safe and secure, and you're going to sort of prime the body to be overreactive to stressors. These are also linked to having low self-esteem, lack of confidence in yourself, and difficulty coping with stress in general. So I got this biological vulnerability is going to interact with some of these psychological vulnerabilities. In some cases, people are taught to be anxious or fearful. And this is through conditioning. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning both play a role in creating and then maintaining anxiety, fear, escape, avoidance behaviors. There's also how you view your experiences. And for some people, they kind of overinterpret physical sensations as signs of danger. If they notice that their heart is beating just a little bit faster, they think, oh my God, my heart is beating a little bit faster. And now what does it do? It beats even faster. So their interpretation of sort of how they feel physically, they're overreacting to it, and that's making it worse. There's also a tendency to catastrophize. Oh my gosh, the worst things are going to happen. Everything is going to be terrible and horrible and awful. Kind of focusing on that negative. That could be something that is partially genetic. It could also be something that is learned. But the final factor here is stressful life events. What we find is that people have this biological vulnerability, this psychological vulnerability, and then something stressful happens. And it can be a big stressor, or it can be what you and I would interpret as a relatively minor stressor. But because they have this vulnerability, it tips them into this overreaction phase. So one of the things that we see when it comes to anxiety disorders is if you have an anxiety disorder diagnosis, you almost always have at least one other diagnosis. Anxiety disorders share some of the same etiology factors as other disorders. Depression is one of the most common shared diagnoses. We also know that people who have physical diseases and disorders have higher rates of anxiety-based disorders. Could be something about the physical impact of that disease or illness. It could be something about the trauma of being sick, the stress of being sick. We don't know the exact relationship because it varies from person to person. The other thing is that there is an increased risk of suicide, particularly with panic disorder, also with PTSD, and any anxiety disorder that is comorbid with depression. So if I have generalized anxiety disorder and depression, that bumps up my risk. Treatment is going to vary for each disorder. So even though there's this kind of shared etiology, the treatment varies. So we're going to wait and talk about treatment after. What I'd like to do now is focus on the DSM-5 anxiety disorders. So remember, these are separated out from the trauma, stress, and OCD related. And we're going to talk in detail about generalized anxiety disorder with a presentation, social anxiety, specific phobia with a presentation, panic disorder with a presentation, and then agoraphobia. The other two I'm just going to mention right now. The other two disorders used to be in that chapter that just had everything that happened to kids, but that was the only thing they had in common. When we reorganized the DSM-5, they got pulled out, and they were put in this anxiety disorder chapter. So the first one is separation anxiety disorder. Two things to know about this. There is a developmentally appropriate time that we experience anxiety when separated from caregivers and loved ones. A disorder would be something that would be excessive and go beyond that normal developmental phase of life in early childhood. Adults can have this. It's not just a disorder of kids. but it's fear upon separation from home and major attachment figures. So frequently, it's kids being afraid to be separated from their parents, but parents can be afraid of being separated from their kids. Think about a mom that excessively worries that something bad is going to happen to her child if they're not with them. And they're excessively worried and concerned anytime they're not physically with their child. That would be a form of separation anxiety. The other one is selective mutism. And this is thought to be kind of a variant of social anxiety disorder in which people can't talk when they're feeling anxious, and that's almost always a socially anxious place. I got a couple that are a little more focused, and then the last one is a little bit more broad, where you can go and you can take those and take